The non-belief is incoherent omnibus. Number 13. The argument from the is-ought problem. Premise 1. Belief should be withheld until and unless there is sufficient evidence and a reason to warrant such belief. Ought. A wise man therefore proportions his belief to the evidence. Premise 2. Belief is not an act of volition. Is. Belief is not something we do at will. The dominant view in epistemology is that belief formation is involuntary. We cannot simply choose to believe or disbelieve at will. Premise 3. An is cannot be validly be derived from an ought. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god or makes some observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be deduction from others, or entirely different from it. Conclusion. Therefore, the suspension of belief is an ought, but not necessarily an is.
Let's look at the first premise. Belief should be withheld until and unless there is sufficient evidence and reason to warrant such belief. The author classifies this as an ought, aligning it with a quote from Hume. However, when we examine Hume's full statement, this interpretation falls apart. In our reasonings concerning matter of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance, from the highest certainty to the lowest species of moral evidence. A wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence. Hume's position is that belief is not binary, it exists on a spectrum of confidence. One may fully believe, P is true, fully disbelieve, P is false, suspend judgment, I don't know, or tentatively accept, P is likely true but not certain. This directly contradicts premise 1, which suggests a rigid, all-or-nothing approach to belief. Instead of advocating for an absolute withholding of belief, Hume promotes an epistemic norm, adjusting confidence levels based on available evidence. The author's framing of premise 1 distorts Hume's position. Accept it at your own risk, it is not what Hume argues. Premise 2, belief is not an act of volition. The author classifies this as an is, citing Alston. However, upon reviewing the deontological conception of epistemic justification, I found no exact quote matching the one provided. This could be a well-intended paraphrase, but misquoting weakens the argument's credibility. More importantly, premise 2 overstates the involuntariness of belief in a way that Alston does not support. While Alston acknowledges that belief formation is not purely voluntary, he also argues that it is not entirely passive. Epistemic responsibility still applies. Alston writes, "Thus it will sometimes be the case, when I believe that P, that I would not have done so had I done various things in the past that I could and should have done but failed to do. We do not directly control our beliefs, but we are responsible for the practices, habits, and actions that shape them." He illustrates this with an example. Suppose that I accept some idle gossip to the effect that Jim is trying to undermine Susie's position as chair of the department. It may be that had I been doing my duty by way of making myself more critical of gossip, and by way of checking into this particular matter, I would not have formed that belief or would not have retained it for so long. Since we can cultivate better epistemic habits, such as skepticism toward gossip, belief formation is not entirely involuntary, it is subject to epistemic norms. This undercuts premise 2, making the argument weaker. Premise 3, an is cannot validly be derived from an ought. The author does not fully explain Hume's position here. Hume's concern is moral prescriptions. He argues that one cannot derive moral obligations solely from descriptive facts without an independent justification bridging the gap. However, this is a claim about ethics, not epistemic norms. Epistemic norms function procedurally, like scientific methods or court trials. They are not moral obligations but best practices for reasoning. This weakens the argument's use of Hume's is-ought distinction in an epistemic context. The argument concludes. The suspension of belief is an ought, but not necessarily an is. This depends on premise 2's claim that belief is completely involuntary. However, as Alston shows, belief formation is influenced by epistemic responsibility. While we do not control beliefs directly, we can shape them through critical thinking, investigation, and proper epistemic habits. Thus, the argument's conclusion is flawed. Suspending belief is not merely an ought, it is a valid epistemic stance. To summarize, the argument misrepresents Hume's position on belief, overstates Alston's claims about involuntariness, and misapplies the is-ought problem to epistemology. Suspension of belief, when warranted, is not just an abstract norm but a practical and attainable stance.